what do I do to give myself more incentives during the day? And how do I make my small tasks high incentive tasks? And I think I just use food most of the time. I run a lot and I eat a lot of granola.
How to be patient.
Welcome back to How to Be Patient. This is a 100% solo episode with Preston again. So I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, it's Preston, the guy who hosts the podcast that I listen to. Where's Margaret? You might ask. Well, Margaret is working very hard and she is recovering on her Pilates reformer, I think right now. She sends me pictures of it and it's a really cool machine. It's expensive, but it always kind of gives me BDSM vibes a little bit. I feel like if you wanted to, you could get freaky deaky with the Pilates reformer. So either Jason, you can cut that, or Margaret. Those are the thoughts that pop into my head when I see your reformer. But you can't argue with the results. It gets people snatched. And I've done Pilates and it's really hard. But I digress. So I'm here rambling on my own. If you look in the back, I'm gonna move the camera a little bit. I just have a ton of junk everywhere. And there's there's boxes all over my apartment. I'm actually moving this week. And moving is always more stressful than you think it's going to be. I'm like, I'm downsizing into a smaller place. It's closer to downtown. And my whole thought was, this will be a launch pad into going to New England next year. So spoiler, I'm going to fellowship almost certainly. And I'll be going up to the East Coast where housing is a lot more expensive. And I would probably pay double in rent to live in a box. So I was like, what if I just practice living in a box now while I'm in Texas? Because, why not? Well, moving sucks. That's why not. And now I'm just getting, torn up. I also went through this period where I thought, oh my gosh, I just need to sell everything I own. I hate this capitalist system that I live in. And I just want to live out of a backpack on the side of the road and do art. So we've been unraveling a little bit. I've been stress eating a lot of granola and totally neglecting to even look at my calorie tracker. And none of this is actually what this episode is about today. Today, we're going to be talking about ADHD. So I guess maybe the tangents are somewhat tangentially related to the topic at hand. But what is interesting about the episode today is that I want to talk about how this study that I read reframed how I was thinking about a lot of ADHD. And I always knew it had to do with the attention networks, and there's problems with reward, incentives, and procrastination. But I always thought that fundamentally it's that you cannot, even if you wanted to, you cannot sustain your attention. And even early on in residency, I would think, maybe it's more diagnostic of ADHD that people can't focus on the things that they want to do. But this study came out back in 2010. I somehow missed it. I think I was 13 at the time. I was busy playing Call of Duty and being in middle school instead of paying attention to this study. But fortunately, I have good professors who brought this up during our neuroscience curriculum. So we went through it and I thought I would share it with you guys. Okay, so when we come back from this break, we were going to talk about task-related default mode network modulation and inhibitory control in ADHD, the effects of motivation methylphenidate, which sounds like a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo if you're not into neuroscience, but essentially it's basically how do doing tasks relate to our brain's ability to control attention in people with ADHD when they are motivated to do something or when they're given stimulants to do that thing. So let's find out. Margaret and I are very excited to tell you about a healthcare news podcast that just came out called Medlines.
It's a quick weekly wrap-up of everything in our field, from breakthrough discoveries and research to politics and, of course, medical pop culture.
I think the best way to conceptualize this podcast is it's like NPR's Up First, but for medicine. So they're short, to the point, with episodes no longer than 15 minutes.
And it's written and created by an amazing team, some of whom you might recognize, Dr. Glaucomflecken and Lady Glaucomflecken, as well as many people here at the Human Content Podcast Network.
With thanks for their inaugural sponsor, the New England Journal of Medicine. New episodes of Medlines are out wherever you get your podcasts, with new episodes out every Friday. And we are back to talk more about this study. So, a little bit of background on what they're even concerned about checking out. This is looking at the ways we switch on or off our attention networks, and we care about this because that's how we get stuff done. Your brain knows that time is money, and ultimately it has to figure out, where do I direct my time and my attention effectively, because I need to get the tasks done that I need to do. Executive function is adaptive in evolution. So the way our brain has kind of solved this problem, the way we understand it in neuroscience, is that we have different networks that modulate our attention. We have one network that's called the default mode network, which is essentially our kind of idle position, our daydreaming network. It's where we sit in this network when we're contemplating things, when we're planning stuff, when we're imagining things. So those are all very useful, right? It helps you generate new ideas. And also, you're taking in information from your environment and you're labeling it with certain levels of importance. So your salience network, or salience meaning like, is this important or not, also plays a role in that. So you're wide open. Then when you want to focus on something, you actually turn off that network, and then you turn on this thing called the ventral attention network, which allows you to sustain your focus on that task. We've seen studies in the past where in normal controls, they will have someone in an fMRI and they'll be mapping that default mode network and then the other network, and they just kind of flip flop on and off really effectively. But in ADHD, they don't always flip off one or the other. It'll be like actually harder for them to turn off the default mode network. So like when they're trying to focus on a task, they're still just kind of daydreaming a little bit more. And I think if anyone listening to this has ADHD, they'd probably relate to that. That when they're trying to do a task or something, they can only sustain attention for like short little bursts, but there's still something else creeping in or something else that's pulling away their attention. This is important though, because there are cases where patients with ADHD can sustain their attention, and that doesn't make sense to people. And I think a lot of this leads a lot of people to think, hey, this is all just behavioral. I think he's just being difficult, because how can my kid who likes to play video games sit there for 4 hours straight, just staring at the video game and nothing else and not be distracted? And then when he tries to do homework or chores or clean his room, he can't stay on task at all. To me, it seems like he just doesn't want to do that. And that's not an unreasonable conclusion to make when you're watching the behavior of someone with ADHD. Actually, back in the day, it was called, before it was called minimal brain dysfunction, I think it was called like moral dysregulation. Like ADHD was like considered a moral problem before it was ever a neurologic problem. And even today, it's still considered that way. So this paper actually kind of explains that and gets at it a little bit. So that's the background context, and let's kind of get into what the study's talking about here. This took place at the Oxford Department of Experimental Psychology in 2010 to 2011, where they took 18 children who were diagnosed with ADHD. At the time, it was the DSM-4 combined type, but we still have that in the DSM-5 classification. And then we had 18 matched, typically developing individuals. These are children and teens between the ages of 9 and 15. So they basically had 2 task-paced go, no-go conditions that they did under an fMRI. So basically, they have you play this like little simulated game, and some of them you get like rewards and tokens for the game. I think in some of these studies you get money or like candy, whatever is like relevant to the kid. The actual nature of the game and the incentives aren't as important. It's just that in some scenarios they generate high incentive for participating in the game. So if I'm playing Frogger and I know I get $5 every time I get the frog to cross the highway, that's a high incentive game, versus another game where I just have to drag and drop stuff and, fill in data on an Excel spreadsheet. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to know that if your job is data entry in like the early 2010s, that's a low incentive task. And you're just sitting there going, wow, I'd really love for something called ChatGPT to come around and replace me because anything to get me out of this cubicle. You know what I mean? So back to the simulation, they put you in this fMRI and they have you play video games. Some of them are exciting, some of them are not. And then here's where it gets interesting. So they did the controls and then the ADHD kids, and then they tried the ADHD kids again, but this time they gave them their medication. So those are kind of the three different scenarios because they want to see, do the meds actually make a difference here? So the first finding was when they had boring tasks with no medication, the ADHD kids had a lot of trouble turning off their default mode network. Like they couldn't actually turn it off at all. If we'll paste a copy of the graph up here, but essentially it was just stuck, um, completely activated. And then they took the control group and they had them do the low incentive task, and they were still able to deactivate their default mode network. So even though it was boring, the typically developing kids in fMRI showed evidence that they were able to still activate their attention, focus it on there, where the kids with ADHD couldn't. And then in the next task, they did high incentive. So this is the exciting video game task, where you're getting paid to play Frogger. The neurotypical kids went through the task again, and just like with the low incentive task, they were able to deactivate their default mode network. So they were focusing on it. But what's interesting is that off medication, when the ADHD kids did this task, they also were able to deactivate their default mode network. So for the fun, exciting task, the ADHD kids were actually physiologically able to activate their attention centers in ways that were similar to normally developing kids. It was just for the boring tasks, which is really fascinating. And I think that kind of makes sense with the video game observations that we're making. But then you take the low incentive task, we go back to it with the ADHD kids, and this time let's give them methylphenidate and see what happens. And they actually were able to deactivate their default mode network and focus more similarly to the controls. So it was much easier for them to divide and focus their attention on a stimulant for boring tasks. So this kind of reframes how you would think about ADHD. It's not necessarily that the attention system is completely broken and that you can't deactivate your default mode network and activate your ventral attention network for any task at all, but it's really the tasks that you're excited about. And it would suggest almost that ADHD has more to do with the rewards that you get for each task or like the perceived importance of it than the actual ability to regulate and control your attention. And in theory, you could say that the dopamine reuptake that's occurring in Ritalin may have more of an effect on your attention control via the reward system pathway. So essentially allowing you to simulate getting more of a reward from doing mundane tasks and therefore direct your attention towards it than actually correcting the infrastructure of your underlying attention network. Really interesting stuff. And also a way to tell us, hey, this is something that I might have known for a long time, because everyone who's had an ADHD kid in a classroom or at home knows that if you want to get them to focus on small things, you have to gamify it. You have to make it exciting. You have to try to make the low incentive tasks a little bit higher incentive, whereas the stimulant just kind of wipes that whole slate clean. It's all high incentive because the incentive is coming from somewhere else. So I think this is especially ironic because the most important tasks that we often have in our lives are boring. School, work, like social obligations, working out, brushing your teeth, showering. Like 90% of what any of us do during the day is low incentive and it's mundane. So that also, I think, especially highlights the dysfunction that someone with ADHD has, where they go through 90% of their day and they're trying their hardest to do each of these tasks and they just can't focus on anything that's like not exciting or not boring. So it would make sense that they would want to do something that they are capable of focusing on. So I guess you can see how when people do find something that sparks their interest, they just want to hold on to it and stick with it, even if it's at the expense of all the other boring or unexciting or frustrating, tedious tasks. The other thing to kind of take into account is that methylphenidate is primarily a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It has a slightly different mechanism than Adderall, which, in addition to dopamine reuptake, also actually disperses dopamine from vesicles inside the synapse. So this study wasn't done with Adderall, which may have a different relationship when we're actually stimulating a surge or increasing the amount of dopamine in the way that it affects the attention networks. Off the top of my head, I can imagine anything that would be like too different about it, but just something to take into account. And I guess kind of coming back to the end of the study, it's really interesting and it's also small. So this was with it's just 18 kids on both sides. And the other thing that I would be curious about is how this occurs more in adulthood. So ADHD can impact the rate of pruning and maturing of your cortex or your gray matter, but a lot of people can actually normalize or kind of reach a similar threshold in adulthood. So some of those like really profound gaps that you see in adolescence, maybe they level out. So I think it would be really fascinating, and it probably or maybe exists, though it's not in the context of this podcast, a study on adults looking at default mode network deactivation using stimulants. And I think it would also be interesting to do it using various stimulants and also non-stimulant medications that impact similar receptors. So viloxazine or Quellbary, the new kid on the block, atomoxetine or Strattera, in addition to Adderall, Vyvanse, methylphenidate, Focalin, like those all maybe have subtle differences in the default mode network activation. Though the biggest challenge for a lot of these is that fMRI studies are super expensive, and you don't necessarily want to sit someone in fMRI and be like, okay, we're just going to do a round robin of every single stimulant we can find. We're going to see how your brain does before it gets completely fried. So that's it's kind of like the biggest takeaway that I have from today. Uh, it really makes me wonder, what do I do to give myself more incentives during the day, and how do I make my small tasks high incentive tasks? And I think I just use food most of the time. I run a lot and I eat a lot of granola. Like when I was prepping for this podcast, actually, I was kind of stressed about reading this paper and making sure I had something to do, and also I don't know. Maybe I seem comfortable right now, but it's kind of strange just like talking alone into the microphone. No one's here to give you feedback. And also, no one's here to disagree with me. So who knows? But yeah, I just that Love Crunch, um, raspberry chocolate granola that you get at Whole Foods. I read a little bit, write a little bit, go get some granola. Boom, high incentive task. Deactivate my default mode network like it's nothing. That's most of what I got for you today. I don't know if I have anything else to say other than like keep in mind that ADHD might actually be more of a salience problem and a reward problem than solely an attention deficit. And it's really that your attention laser works right, and you just gotta know how to point it in the right direction. Um, this weekend's the move. It's about to go down. I'm actually I don't love using AI all the time, but I've been using it to do like mock-ups of the apartment, and that's actually been kind of useful. I also like got one of these like apartment design, like interior design programs, and I've been playing around with it. These things are not intuitive at all, but the the desire to like live in a comfortable place is high enough incentive that, I think anyone could stay locked in on it. So I'm curious what you guys think, just about the paper in general, or how this kind of folds into your understanding of ADHD. Uh, Call into the pod, or like go on our website and leave a voice note if this resonates with you. If either with your own story with ADHD or patients you've seen with ADHD or siblings, and how, like, considering the reframe of it being more of a reward problem than an attention problem, if that is something that you find interesting, or if you disagree with it, because ultimately this is one study from 15 years ago that looked at 36 people. So, we got to spend a lot more time fleshing this stuff out. But anyways, I'm just gonna keep hanging out here by myself. I got Lilac in my lap. She doesn't know we're moving. Otherwise, comment on Instagram, in those Spotify comments. Let us know what you think of the episode. You can always find me at Presro on TikTok and Instagram, and Margaret's at Bad Art Every Day on Instagram and Substack. She'll probably still respond to her DMs, even though she's not on the podcast right now. And that's it, guys. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Preston. Our executive producers are me, Preston Roche, Margaret Duncan, Will Flannery, Kristen Flannery, Aaron Courtney, Rob Goldman, and Shanti Brooke. Our editor and engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by Omer Benz V. To learn more about our program disclaimer and ethics policy, submission verification, and licensing terms, and our HIPAA release terms, go to howtobepatientpod.com or reach out to us at howtobepatient@human-content.com with any questions or concerns. How to Be Patient is a human content production.
How to be patient.
Thank you for watching. If you want to see more of us, or if you want to see, this is Lilac, she's my cat. She's going to be waving her hand at one of the floating boxes, which will lead to more episodes. Lilac, point to the other episodes. Lilac doesn't know what the internet is, but I swear they're there. They probably exist for real. But in the meantime, I'm just going to pet Lilac, and then I'm going to go dance in the background.